These people are absolute legends. You guys and girls just make life worth living, you know? Beyond the Sea fundamentally is a character study of two men living in 1969. It reminded me of a much improved version of last year's film Don't Worry Darling. Instead of painting the male characters as caricatures, we are presented with a deep focus on their ranging emotions and reactions to tragedy, isolation, and temptation. A true what-if episode inspired by the working from home antics of the 2020 lockdowns. This episode is more akin to a movie in length, like a certain other space episode that Aaron Paul had a cameo in 6 years prior.
You better run. King of Space right here. King of Space.
I don't think there's any real connection to be made between that episode and the one in question today, so I thought I'd get that out of the way before we jump into the theoretical possibility of the two sharing a universe. This episode shares more commonality with the episode Be Right Back, where a replica replaces another absent loved one. As a result, Beyond the Sea presents a familiar, uncomfortable feeling from the offset. This episode also draws parallels with the film 2001: A Space Odyssey. David is attending his son's birthday, just as Dr. Floyd video calls his daughter on hers. The astronaut on the Jupiter mission in 2001 not only happens to also be called David.
I'm sorry, Dave. I'm afraid I can't do that.
But is also a talented sketch artist. Other references include the use of wide-angle lenses in this episode's photography, whilst also making use of a rotating camera to illustrate the uncanny emotions the characters must be experiencing. The episode is able to stand on its own 2 feet with this alternative history angle the show is honing in on for this episode and Demon 79. As opposed to being set in the present or the future, things are shaken up to create the suspension of disbelief. Writing for The Verge, Addie Robertson argues that setting the episode in the past heightens the sense of isolation the characters feel. You don't have Zoom or other technologies to ease the quarantine anxieties of those in this story. Meanwhile, you also have to accept that Mission Control has basically zero input into the pair's everyday activities on board the ship throughout the episode, doing practically nothing to prevent the disaster that unfolds. It's also strange to think that they didn't send the replicas into space with their human counterparts living on Earth. Cliff shows more traditional values of the time by saying grace, insisting his wife Lana make dinner, and displays dismay that he couldn't demonstrate his usual strength to his son. His wife is equally stoic but also a bookworm. The books that she reads are rather tongue-in-cheek references to Charlie Brooker's influences. For example, when he watched the movie adaptation of The Illustrated Man, it
scared the shit out of me.
It also happens that this book, like Black Mirror, is an anthology of stories. David, meanwhile, shows creativity as well as passion and enthusiasm about the mission. He thrives off of the popularity he generates, whilst his wife errs on the side of caution at the attention he brings towards his family. Interestingly, he even has drawings and a bonsai tree in his bedroom up in space, whereas Cliff has nothing to show. Not only are the two main characters in stark contrast to one another, but the presentation of their relationships with their wives displays this contrast also, one which is warm and sensual, and the other that is pragmatic and dutiful. The contrast is established not just through the cinematography, but also the way that the music, though diegetic at first, moves from the scene with David briefly into the scene with Cliff, and then back to David again. Interestingly, the song that plays here is La Mer by Charles Trenet. La Mer is literally French for the sea, and the lyrics are simply about how beautiful the sea is. It's a very romantic vision. Bearing in mind it is a post-war song as well, Charlie describes the piece as atmospheric, beautiful, and simultaneously haunting. This episode's title seems to be suggesting that through the nostalgic aesthetics for an ideal life, we find possessive, fragile men desperately clinging to their families. Far more focus is given to David in this montage, as though to signify he has much more going on romantically than Cliff and Lana do. Even their farewells represent their differences. Cliff leaves as a matter of duty, whilst David David goes with tenderness and a concerted effort to make sure that he sees his wife before they go to sleep. The lighting, though at first reflective, begins to match up as the pair enter their realities in space. We see a harsher blue-white light as their respective yet identical metal frames with curtains come into view. The chair designs give off clunkier and outdated aesthetics, as though the apparatus were made of recycled hospital equipment. It's almost as though a dental chair and a life support machine were merged to create this rather unsettling means of transporting consciousness from one place to another. It is a lot more clinical and ugly when compared with the simpler and shinier technologies we witness in prior Black Mirror episodes. Despite the pair's different lifestyles and personalities, they are dependent on each other to survive in space. Even from this early in the episode, it's astounding just how early the signs of catastrophe make themselves apparent. Despite David expressing a concerning amount of interest in Lana,
Cape Ann gonna be cosmopolitan enough for her?
I only met her the once, but she struck me as quite the butterfly. When's her next physical?
they have a purely professional relationship. Cliff seems to be the only person in his family that is appreciating the move from the city to the country. He rejects the idea of having a party at their place. Perhaps he is antisocial. This makes him perfect for the job in space, but how that reflects on his wife and son is what David exploits later in the episode. Meanwhile, a group of radical hippies decide to kill replica David and his entire family. The leader Kappa uses the rationale that the family isn't natural. There doesn't seem to be any religious connotations to the group's dialogue, nor does the episode show any true cost on society by having replicas in this alternate 1969. The episode is more dependent on the viewer having prior knowledge of Charles Manson and his followers. The murder in this episode is reminiscent of the real-life Tate murders. It's a shame that these characters don't return for the rest of the episode. We find out that the group turned themselves in, and that's all we hear of them from there. There might be some tie-in with 1960s activists believing space exploration to be a waste of money when people around the country were suffering from poverty. Plus, we know now in the present day that space exploration can have frightening consequences because it's just so dangerous. Perhaps this explains why the men are sent into space and not the replicas, displaying a naivety towards these very dangers. Either way, this event is simply a means of setting up the actual conflict of the episode between the two men fighting over Lana. Cliff and Lana then discuss the massacre.
Can't they make him another replica somehow?
Even if they could, what does he have left here?
That's absolutely fair to assume, but it made me wonder if David had any family or friends outside of his household he could contact. Such questions seem irrelevant when this idea of masculine possession gets thrown into the mix. Den of Geek writer Louisa Meller argues in her article about this episode that the men see their families as their possessions.
My wife! You creep! My wife! Mine!
I don't have anything. I've got nothing at all. Everything I had, gone.
She is mine for all time. She is mine.
It is interesting how selective the dialogue is and makes this theory quite valid. Ownership of the car, the house, the family, it's an idyllic vision of the American lifestyle that might make men see their families in this way. In relation to these replicas, however, perhaps their very existence removes the need for communication with Earth to be built into the spacecraft. There does seem to be some kind of communication though. Cliff finds out about the massacre from a phone call, and David is seen watching his family's funeral from space. Even the filming of a funeral seems quite a morbid idea, but then again, these two are quite famous, and the funeral would probably have been quite high profile. This leaves David to be seen moping around the ship with evidence of reading The Illustrated Man and eating shit. Another element of the world building that is left out is what exactly the pair's mission in space is. We only know that the pair are 2 years in with 4 to go, so it's presumably a round trip. With David being in almost total isolation, he chooses to end his life before Cliff's hand is forced in order to prevent termination of the mission. The most he can do is be there for the essential space routines like exercise and keeping the plants alive. This is where both the body swapping starts, and Aaron Paul's performance truly shines. At the risk of making his performance too comical, he definitely downplays the intricacies of David's character. The absolute peak of the episode for me was the moment when he breaks down in front of that tree. For that feeling of being liked is something David has not only missed, but the prospect of it ever happening again was put into question with his isolation. It's a wonderfully long take as well, going on for well over a minute. Seeing Aaron Paul tear up naturally instead of having some drip put into his eyes before his take makes the moment all the more heartrending. His eyes are so red, and it takes some real talent to make that kind of thing happen spontaneously. It makes for such a contrast as well between the two characters. Cliff would not be seen dead crying in front of his wife, and Lana is forced to be comforting in this moment, lest she be judged for being heartless. It's also worth noting that we don't learn much about what Cliff's child Henry is like, only that he has an impressionable mind and calls his father Sir. He can tell that something has changed when we see him observing his mother actually spending some time with who he believes is his father. Apparently he knows his father would never paint either, eventually leading him to act on his suspicions by ruining the painting.
It'd be strange for you and Henry.
Henry doesn't need to know.
It's so naive of the parents to think their own son wouldn't notice. Then again, the setting of the episode can be brought into the equation. This is a time where the beating of children is normalized and would naturally lead to them fearing their parents. Despite the similarity of the attitudes towards child beating, it's clear that this montage of life in the balance strikes up more contrast between the two men. Lana then gets taken to the bookstore, and David picks out The Moon is a harsh mistress for her. It's less about him wanting to get Lana into science fiction and more because the plot of this particular book involves a penal colony revolting against Earth rule on the moon, where the male prisoners outnumber the females 2-1. Perhaps this is a way of David trying to introduce the idea of polyandry into the trio's relationship. The scene itself I found to be pretty great, with the shopkeeper asking questions that mirror the scene in the cinema earlier with David and his family. This time he has to essentially play that role of celebrity but be lying about his identity at the same time. One other interesting element of this sequence was the way that these two shots were edited together. The episode seemed to be leading us on with the idea of Lana's attraction to David, with her feeling the book spine whilst he draws her in outer space. I appreciated Lana not so easily falling for David. The episode might have fallen into cliche somewhat, with Cliff being cucked by a younger, bigger guy trapped inside his own body. David might have successfully seduced Lana if he had leaned harder into enacting the role of Lana's husband, as opposed to using his own tried and tested tricks of playing romantic French music, then moving in for a fondle. For a moment, it works until it doesn't, and Lana saying,
You are a guest in this house.
And you want this?
You don't know me.
really puts him in his place. Finally, this shot of the record finishing indicates that the fun is over and time for David has run out. I really was expecting Cliff to flip out here, if only for the fact that he was repeatedly kept waiting in space to return to his family. Instead, he reacts just as minimally as when David was about to jump out of the airlock.
Everything okay? All fine. Everything okay? Sure.
This might be down to his antisocial personality. Him consoling David after the death of his family is almost textbook, apologizing, putting his hand on his shoulder. Cliff is probably the last person David wants to be around in his time of grief, but he has no choice. Even directly after this, Cliff merely appears as a presence. He never thought that his job would require him to be anything more than a cold, calculating, duty-ridden machine. However, Cliff does have to walk a fine line with this delicate scenario he finds himself in. David has to be kept happy in case he jeopardizes the mission, as Cliff will go down with him. I wasn't sure why they needed to show us the treadmill breaking down. Why didn't he just use the other one? They're not exactly identity locked, they don't need their tags to operate them. It just seemed like a weird excuse for Cliff to decide to go and check out David's room where he finds all the naughty drawings of Lana. Another question that arises in the mind at this point: who Who would Cliff take his anger out on? His family, who are far more easily abused, or the man who holds all the cards? Initially, he confronts the latter, which actually led to a Jesse Pinkman outburst.
Maybe I will bust your jaw.
You wanna bust your jaw?
I'm sorry.
I thought Cliff would be a bit more calm and collected about this if he were true to his character, but still it's understandable he would react in this way based on this idea of family possession. It was also interesting that David made the point about Cliff's wife being untouched. He wouldn't truly know this, so it might just be a tactic to rile Cliff up. It also echoes back to the scene when his family died.
Do you have a
Good question.
It's a question we never truly get an answer to. With or without it, presumably the idea of female pleasure isn't something Cliff and his old school religious attitudes would want to entertain. Unable to get satisfaction from hitting David, Cliff starts interrogating his wife. This leads to them making up and a short-lived new equilibrium is reached. Perhaps David would be forgiven for acting out of sheer desperation. Maybe we see a third act of exploring how David could be redeemed. You know, a lot of time goes by in this episode. Maybe they actually reach their destination or complete their mission.
You will not see or speak to her ever again.
This episode needed another 30 minutes at least. Anybody who has seen 2001 knows exactly where this plot is going, except you just have to replace an AI supercomputer with a human simply out for revenge, I guess.
You will not see or speak to her ever again.
You will never see her again literally gives him the key to seeing her again. I want to put this down to Cliff's attachment to the job and, you know, going out into space is a habit now, but I just don't get it. The final scene shows David offering Cliff a seat, but what are they going to talk about? What is there left to discuss?